coming.
Can we hear that whistle one more time?
One more time? All right, those of you who are particularly tall in the back, those of you less tall in the front.
Makes sense. What about those who are wide?
Up on top of the porch.
Those who are wide, where do they go?
Right in the end.
Right on the end, skinny's in the middle.
Tall folks on top of the porch.
That's far enough, guys.
But I'll form you into something. What, I don't know.
Better men have tried.
Tall folks in the back.
All right.
So we are members of the Royal Sussex Society. We portray the British regiments and detachments from the years 1701 through 1918. So basically the War of Spanish Succession, the 18th century, through to the end of the First World War. So we look at the soldiers from Sussex, which is in the south of England, and also other attachments, whether they be Victorian civilians or volunteers, VADs in the First World War, things like that. Suffragettes of the era too.
Really, Victorian.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Got it. So this is the Marine from Peking litigation from the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. The equipment really hadn't changed much in about 15 years. The main difference is they wore this white tropical lightweight uniform, and then they fielded with the 6mm Lee Winchester 1895 rifle, straight pull. Very finicky rifle. It broke a lot. It was very weak. Internals. They particularly did not like the uniform, as I was mentioned before, because it's white. And as you can see, I present a perfect target at distance between the blue. They had complained about it, and eventually they switched over back to their khaki trousers, the blue wool shirt, and the standard tunic, which is a style that the Marine Corps still wears today, but it's a dress uniform, not a field uniform anymore. The Marines went into China in 1900 in response to the Boxers. The Boxers were created because they were against foreign influence. Europe and the United States, they were trying to find colonial influence in China at the time, and Christian missionaries went there, and then the Boxers started killing them and attacking the consulates. And then the Marine Corps, along with other nations' Marines, mostly from Japan as well, about 20,000 of them, went in there to retake and to quell the rebellion and to protect the interests that they had. Ultimately, they decided they got to find a better way to bring China into the Industrial Revolution, and everybody left. The Japanese kind of stayed, and we know what happened later on. And they didn't leave until they were forced out in 1945. So that's, the quick short of it. The Marine Corps had about 300-400 guys, 1st Marine Regiment, and a lot of ships companies were brought in. They lost 49 Marines. There was one major ambush where they lost a lot, about 18 guys. And by the Boxers, they would come in with swords and hand to hand. Eventually, were put back by the 1895, the Craig Jorgensen 30 caliber, and even the trapdoor rifles, 1874, 45-70. When you're firing volley into crowds of people, they'll just eventually go down. Very Spartan, very basic equipment. A shelter half, some ropes, your canteen, some food items, something to drink out of. That's it. There was no MREs. They had rations of hardtack and salted beef, peas, some rice, and they also lived off a local fare as well. Chinese food. And and that was basically the start of the Marine Corps' influence in China. They would go back in the 30s, and then they would go back again after World War II and occupy it up until the communists then took over. And then we would face them again in Korea.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
We represent the Papal Zouaves. Papal Zouaves were soldiers that fought for the Pope from 1861 to 1870, and in 1870 to 71 they fought for the French army in the Franco-Prussian War. So we represent troops that defended the Papal States and fought against Garibaldi and his brigands, and then eventually the Italian army and the fall of Rome. And after the fall of Rome, we were sent to France, and we volunteered and fought for the French army.
Oh, anything else of interest?
That's pretty much it.
All right.
I mean, it's,
No, thank you.
yeah.
And now I want to get, since the three of you now in the picture, that's even better.
They're anti-careful.
Sure. So what we're presenting today is the world aspect of the First World War. My colleague here is attired as a officer of the German East African Schutztruppe, or protection forces, and I'm attired as a Obermatrose, or senior sailor in China. Germany had a protectorate in China. There's headquarters for the East Asia Cruiser Squadron. And that's kind of the gist of what we're presenting here. And we have a lot of items that would have been carried by the Marines, sailors, and Schutztruppe personnel that would have been across the world at the beginning of 1914.
Germany also had a series of colonies throughout the Pacific. Those fell very quickly and very peacefully at the beginning of the war or into the war later on. People talk about, for example, we still call it today American Samoa. Most people don't realize that the other half of Samoa at that time was German Samoa. New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Marshalls, the Carolines, places that become famous in World War II were all German possessions that had been taken from them at the beginning of World War I. The main centers of resistance overseas for the Germans at the beginning of World War I were in Africa with their 4 colonies: Cameroon, Togo, German East Africa, and German Southwest Africa. With the exception of German's East Africa, most of those fell fairly quickly. Okay? But German East Africa managed to resist by fighting guerrilla warfare throughout the entire colony and even moving into Portuguese territory until after the armistice in 1918. They were the only force that were still active without having walked away from the war until they were informed that they had signed an armistice in Europe. Kyoto?
Kyoto was a protectorate similar to the arrangement the British had with China, at least territory. So Germany acquired the area in 1897. It was sort of a target of opportunity. There was a assassination of 2 Catholic German missionaries by Chinese nationalists in 1897. And it just happened that the cruiser squadron in Asia, who had been renting property from the British in Hong Kong, found a chance to land forces in retribution for this assassination, and in the process of doing so managed to force a concession from the Chinese government to lease a very excellent port facility from China for 100 years. This would get reinvested by larger naval forces in the name of an entire battalion of Marines that came over about a few months after it was acquired, and eventually that would become the port city of Qingdao, port city of Qingdao in the province of Kyoto. It was the headquarters for the East Asia Cruiser Squadron, and the Germans invested a lot into it. It wasn't a colony per se, it was run by the Navy itself, so they had a lot more leeway to invest in projects that would have benefited not just the Navy itself, but the Chinese citizens whom they were working with. You have not just the port facility that was supporting the cruiser squadron, but also plumbing, libraries, schools, railways. You have banking institutions that come up to facilitate trade, and it becomes a model city, not just in the eyes of the German Empire, but also in the eyes of Chinese Republicans who are looking to form a new democratically elected government after the fall of the Chinese Empire in 1909, 1910. Even Sun Yat-sen, who was the first president of the Republic of China, came through and realized that the Germans were benefiting the Chinese much more than any other European power at the time, and called them the model country to base future growth off of for China as a nation entering the 20th century.
So you have what is particularly an attractive place that the Germans have taken from a fishing village to a modern port facility, attracting the Japanese. And the Japanese had wanted a foothold on the Chinese mainland for a long time. And so when the war breaks out, having already had a treaty with the British dating from the early 1900s, that they would undertake operations in the case of a war in the Asia-Pacific area, the Japanese decided that they were going to invest Qingdao. They sent about 36,000 Japanese troops, and the Germans were able to muster about 3,800 individuals and fought them for about 2.5 months until they were forced to surrender. To the day, 17 years after they had occupied the colony.
Okay, so piggybacking off the idea of Germans investing into territory, this kind of leans into some of the industry that Germany brought to a rather undeveloped area of China in the early part of the 20th century. Of course, we know that Germans culturally can't go anywhere in the world without beer. So, of course, the military personnel that are serving in Kiaochao, the civilians, the sailors that are coming and doing trade, they all want to make sure they can come into a spot and have a good, half liter, full liter of proper German beer. Problem is trying to ship from Germany itself around Africa without being able to use the Suez Canal constantly, coming across the Indian Ocean up through China. Anything tends to spoil, especially with rudimentary refrigeration techniques that they had in the early 20th century. So instead of maintaining this operation and trying to develop technology that didn't exist yet, Germany just took a brewmaster from an existing brewery and a team of his and sent them over to China to start a brewery from the ground up there. They started from the Germania Brauerei in Bavaria, and they named the new brewery in China as such. So they have Germania Brauerei in Qingdao, China. They started this in 1903 with an eye for German palates, but also realizing the opportunity to make beer for all other palates and tastes that were coming through the area of East Asia at the time. That includes making ales for the British that are coming through Hong Kong. You have the Dutch in Indonesia. You have the Russians up to the north who have a taste for stronger beer. And the Americans who nearly are doing a lot of work with the Philippine insurgency at the time. So you have a lot of folks that are interested in drinking beer, and the Germania Brauerei would like to provide. You can kind of see in this image here, I don't know if that's going to show up or not. They built a brewery in downtown in 1903, and because of their proficiency in all different types of styles, they started to win accolades across the world at international beer competitions. So, by 1906, 3 years after they opened, they're already internationally recognized, making great beer for everybody. This is a copy of the size, bottle, and the label that they would have been producing from 1903 to 1914. The problem happens when World War I breaks out, and Japan, as we talked about earlier, was very interested in this territory. Of course, the Germans are forced to surrender after 3 months of siege. Japanese respect, though, the Germans' tenacious defense and treat the city and the colony with a lot of respect. It was more of a business deal by force rather than animosity between the two powers. So Japan actually ends up paying Germany for a lot of the industries that they acquire in this invasion, including the brewery. The Japanese see it as an investment. They keep it going. The Chinese end up taking it back because the World Court denies Japan the right to own the territory because the Germans were only leasing it in the first place from the Chinese. Japan comes back in the 30s, acquire the territory, keep the brewery going, and after Japan loses World War II, the Republic of China runs the brewery. They lose the territory after the Chinese communists take power in 1947. Realize what also an asset a brewery would be for their own economy, despite being nationalized, and they keep it going until today, which is why in 2023 you can walk into your favorite Chinese restaurant or any package store and get a nice cold bottle of Tsingtao beer. So from 1903 to 2023, we have a legacy that connects German Tsingtao to present Tsingtao China, and also a beer legacy that leaves a big mark on history. It is now the largest brewery in Asia and continues to be a very popular beer in restaurants across the world.
My name's Brian Kendall. I'm portraying a Frenchman in the Resistance, the Marquis basically preparing for a mission in early June of 1944. In 1940, France loses to Germany, but the entire country isn't occupied. It isn't until 1942, where the army in Africa surrenders, that the Germans basically occupy the entire country. And when that happens, they also institute a forced labor program. This drives a lot of the young people straight out into the hills. They don't want any part of it. So they become what are called the Marquis. The Marquis basically is a type of bush or shrub in the mountains of France. In the hills of France, there are other organizations. There's communists, there's labor, there's all sorts of different people are forming resistance organizations, all come together under the French Forces of the Interior. Now, to help these French Forces of the Interior, the Allies, SOE, puts together what are called Jedburghs. Jedburghs are an American, a Frenchman, and a British, all fluent in French, that they parachute in to liaise with these resistance groups. And through these Jedburgh teams, we get drops of supplies. And as you see before me, we have German weapons. We have the Sten, which is probably the most used of the submachine guns by the resistance, and the number 4 Lee Enfield. Now, in a place called the Vickers Mastiff, where a big resistance uprising happens, the good news is it draws off German divisions. Bad news is they crush the resistance. The resistance gets a lot of supplies right before the battle, dropped from B-17s even. And one of the primary rifles dropped is the number 4. The resistance is often, we sometimes don't thank them enough for what they did to help us land in Normandy and to support us in France. They actually were quite useful. General Eisenhower always said that they were instrumental in the success of D-Day. They helped cut communications. They helped make it so the Germans couldn't bring reinforcements up quickly. So did the American Air Force. And they also, one of the key things that we don't know as Americans, is they basically cover Patton's right flank as he's streaming towards Germany. There are still 2 corps. I believe it's 1st and 14th German Corps in the south of France. And it's the Marquis, the resistance, that are covering Patton's right flank as he proceeds through France. And these resistance fighters are actually fighting quite substantial battles with the Germans as they come. Now, in regards to submachine guns, one of the things I like to point out that the German Schmeisser, which is a misnomer, but the MP40, descended from the MP38, came in around $105 per unit. Now, the British at the beginning of the war had no submachine gun. They go to Enfield, they say we need a submachine gun. Enfield says it can be cheap, it can be reliable, and it can be accurate. Pick two. And the British government says, I want to pick cheap twice. And they come up with the Sten gun finally. The Sten gun comes in at about $10. It is cheap, it is easily constructed. It is what they paid for. There are definitely problems recorded with the Sten gun, but they make it in enough numbers that they can just parachute it in containers over France. The Germans make a copy of the Sten gun at the end of the war. The Warsaw Uprising makes a copy of the Sten gun. It is there's a very famous video of German paratroopers on the back of the King Tiger tank during Bulge, where one of them has the Sten gun. So it is a pivotal piece of equipment to the resistance. It's cheap, easily maintained, fires the exact same cartridge as the German MP40. It checkmarked all the boxes. But again, just representing the resistance, telling people a little bit about what they did to help support the U.S. troops and the Allied troops in France in 1944.
It's a bit of my collection, Edwardian or Victorian and Edwardian bicycles. The beginnings of basically a revolution on wheels in America when they perfected the pneumatic tire bicycle. Cycling took off in the 1890s. Millions of bicycles were sold. It was a revolution. It was pre-automobile. It was the first transportation that you didn't have to feed and water and care for. And it freed up a lot of people, especially on weekends, people who were in the leisure class, people who suddenly had spare extra time on weekends, and they were able to travel to nearby towns in groups. There was an organization called the Wheelmen that was formed, and they would travel around on sometimes upwards of 100 miles a day in groups. They would all stay overnight, and then the next day come back. It was just something that never really happened before in history. Out doing an activity in groups that had no payout. Basically, it was kind of a new idea.
Given the road conditions in those days, how did these bicycles fare? Because you're not like here where you got the asphalt.
Yeah, so interesting about that, because the Wheelman organization had so many members, they actually used their power to get roads paved. Macadam was a new concept back then, and they managed in some towns to get miles and miles of road paved. It was something called the Good Roads Act, and it was just something that only happens when you have numbers of people that are wealthy and have a say in government. Before, now in the earlier period, say this bike here is 1888. This is before pneumatic tires were invented. It was a harder ride, and it was the beginning, but it was tough. Now, just a handful of years later, John Dunlap invented pneumatic tire, and that was in the late 1880s. And it revolutionized the bicycle. Suddenly, you had something that was didn't jerk you around and jostle you with every little pebble and rock.
Why the bellows camera?
So this is a cycle poco camera. This was marketed in that same era. Photography was very, very popular, becoming popular. And it was no longer just for professional photographers. In 1895, the Rochester Camera Company marketed the Cycle Poco camera. It has a mount that you mount it on the bike. You have a remote shutter. Even though it's glass slides, and you weren't really expecting to take pictures while you ride, but you're treating your bicycle like an instantaneous tripod. So you'd be going through the countryside, you'd see something that you wanted to take your picture of, you're all ready to go, and then you're ready to hit the road again. It was it was quite a time, you know, the invention of phonograph, photography that became home, transportation. It was a real time of enlightenment. Publishing was big. I'm John Elaney, Passaic, New Jersey, and I've been collecting bicycles for 35 years.
Ready? Okay. So this is a Soviet SVT-40. This one was made in 1941. This is one of the rifles that Soviet soldiers held during combat in World War II. So we're just going to give a quick firing demonstration of how this works, just as a quick overview. This weapon, you could say it's comparable, or the Soviet equivalent of the M1 Garand. Holds a 10-round magazine that you load from the bottom like this. Unlike the M1 Garand, which is loaded from the top. Very simply, when you want to fire, you take the safety off like this, and you rack back the action like so. And when you're ready to fire, fire in the hole! And when it's done, it stays open like this. You just take the magazine out, and then you can actually load it from the top if you want, but I prefer just to load it from the magazine, it's a little easier. And that's an SVT-40. Sure. My name? My name is Matt Viscaldi. I'm with the 9th Soviet Guards.